Probably not,
This is
because
the thing,
I can explain why. I can tell you why. I did study a lot about the Soviet Union, but look, Stalin was a fucking idiot. That's the main problem with it. Huh?
He was a sociopath.
Yes, and he was also an idiot. Because Hitler was kind of a sociopath, but he wasn't as stupid as Stalin. He had the good sense of giving his generals
Content over everything!
the ability to rule over the armies, because he knew that he wasn't a genius in terms of tactics. He did do some good moves, like for example the invasion of France through the... he invaded France.
He didn't do it.
He made a blitzkrieg through forests because he bet that the tanks could just plunge through the forest without getting stuck in the trees, and he won with that bet. That was a good move.
But then he didn't really win against Stalin, though.
He didn't.
He didn't.
He didn't, because he was in a run against time to gain some ground against
even the battles isolated, just the battles they had in particular, he didn't particularly do that very well, because Hitler overstated his kind of like, I guess, military dominance within Russia, not realizing that
Germany
Russians
wasn't ready
had... Yeah, absolutely. They were not ready for the Soviet Union.
Even though they were very well equipped.
What I was trying to say...
They weren't ready.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is, obviously, there's no debate that Stalin was a murderer. There's no debate about that. But the question is, I bring to myself, would we have been able to quarantine the Nazis well enough without that psychopath driving his country into the ground?
It depends who would rule the country.
Germany would have lost eventually.
I don't know, Russia's a big place.
No, when the Americans came into the war, don't forget the Americans were that far away from dropping the bomb on Japan. They would have dropped it on Germany as well to finish the war. Japan got hit with the two atom bombs.
Yeah.
The Americans would have dropped it on Germany to win. You're not going to surrender, we're going to drop it on you. So I think they would have nuked them.
Yeah, I think there was a very little margin of victory for Hitler. He was against a race. He was in a race by starting World War II. Hitler was in a race against time. He was in a race against population, because the other powers had a lot more population and a lot more military power than him.
Well, he didn't want to fight France and Britain. His real enemy was Russia. When you speak to German,
his main enemy were the Jews. The main one that he named, the main enemy he named, were the Jews.
They were scapegoats.
I think they were scapegoats. I don't think they were enemies at all. I think the same as migrants now, they're just scapegoats. I mean, nationalism will always...
there were definitely scapegoats.
Nationalism will always find some kind of scapegoat. But for him, I think the German people, their biggest enemy was themselves.
If he didn't attack Russia, communism would take over.
It was a very big possibility, because the Soviet Union had a lot more military prowess and military power than all of the different Western countries combined.
This is where the murdering comes in.
They had a lot of power, which makes it almost a miracle how well Hitler did in the beginning of the Second World War. They just plunged through the Soviet lands. How? The Soviets had more tanks, they had more planes, they had a lot more people in the army, and their technology wasn't much worse.
Geography is a big importance in this one. I mean, bear in mind, like, with Russia in particular, there was a massive amount of illiteracy and a massive amount of poverty that had happened just before World War I. So even by World War II, that hadn't increased significantly. So the idea that they managed to plow through, it's not that hard to plow through a bunch of farmers, you know what I mean?
Soldiers, look. I'll throw another 20 million. If Stalin lost 20 million soldiers, fine, I'll send another 20 million.
Yeah, exactly.
Germany didn't have
you don't need to know how to read to be able to shoot a gun. You don't need to be able to read for those simple things. Obviously,
you need to know how to read
pilot
to
a
shoot
plane,
a gun, but not to fire a gun.
To
fire a gun.
Yeah. But look, my point is, the reason why the Soviet Union lost so many battles, at least in the beginning, the main reason for that was that their generals were a bunch of complete fools. And why were they a bunch of complete fools? Because Stalin exterminated all the good generals. Because he was doubting their loyalty. He only kept the yes men, the ones who agreed with him completely. The ones that had almost zero possibility of rebelling.
And that's what Erdogan's done in Turkey now.
Yeah.
He's taken the experience.
But this is a common.
Erdogan's done the same thing. The good officers, they're in prison. Now he's put the yes men.
But this is a common tactic of any
but it's not good because you're experienced when you're gone.
Not any of them, not any.
Really?
But
to the Polish, he did the same thing to the Polish officer class. He exterminated them. Had them all killed and buried in mass graves.
But again,
so they can't rise up.
I think the original question was, again, without Stalin's 80 million murdering, again, not approving of his sacrifice, what do you think the world would look like today?
You know that Trotsky was a much better military leader than Stalin.
Well, here's the thing. A lot of people, this is why I have such a big contempt for people who try to put off Stalin as a communist, because Stalin was not a communist in the slightest.
He was a socialist.
Lenin on his deathbed warned against Stalin. He
did.
said to people, this guy will fuck up the country.
He did.
Right? And again, like you said, Trotsky was a much more prominent leader. He was coming off the school of thought that Lenin had put forward, right? Lenin had given the land to the people, as he promised during his communist riots, right? Stalin took that back in order to revert back to capitalistic nature, in order to push, industrial revolution, because he was on the He was on the verge of, not the verge, he was always of the notion that the Second World War was coming, as every country was. So the question is, how much scrutiny can we give a man like that, despite the fact that what he did ultimately contributed to the life that we have today?
No, I
Not on a moral,
I don't
just
know what Europe would have looked like if they. You mean if Germany didn't attack Russia?
no. If Russia did not industrialize itself at the rate that it did, sacrifice 80 million people at the rate that it did to achieve the military dominance that it had, if it didn't have that, what would the world look like today? Would they have had enough defense to fight against the Germans? Would they have been able to defend against the Germans, considering the poverty rate and the illiteracy rate of the Russians at the time? That's what I'm trying to say. So
Probably not.
can only go
Probably
back.
not. He had, as you say, in the 1930s, he had a plan to develop 1,000 years in 10 years. That was his catchphrase, 1,000 years in 10.
Yeah.
And they actually, a lot of people actually reckon that industrialisation saved Russia during the Second World War.
But it's a grim thought. It's 80 million, right? We often say, we're like, oh, communists killed 80
and they're
million
not
or
sure
whatever.
about the numbers
You
either.
know, the thing is,
Apparently, it was high enough. It was high enough is the point, right? But my point is that, how much scrutiny do we give that, knowing that it's contributed to the life that we have
man,
today?
I know what you mean.
I can only go by what maybe 100 years previous, when Napoleon tried it. They weren't industrialised then, and he failed. Once the Russian,
That's a good point.
he got into Moscow. Well, what they did, the Russians pulled back, burnt everything,
Oh yeah,
scorched earth,
Burn Moscow,
and left him there to freeze.
Yeah.
So
The
Maybe
German
not.
German army was blunted by Russian weather. That's
they
what
didn't
you're
expect to
saying.
take it that long. They thought it would be finished before then. Obviously,
Totally
they wanted to quit.
unprepared.
Look, I don't
Summer
think the
clothes,
amount
Same mistake as
of
Napoleon.
victims, the amount of kills that Stalin provoked, that Stalin did in the Soviet Union, has a direct correlation to the industrialization. The industrialization could still happen with less kills. You know how in China, I always like to give the example of China, because Mao's Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward was some of the worst. It was some of the worst ideas and politics put in function in a country ever. During the Great Leap Forward, he did a specifically bad thing, which was the four-plague policy. It was to exterminate all mosquitoes, flies, rats, and sparrows. So they started by the easy ones, by the rats and the sparrows. They exterminated all sparrows in China. All sparrows in China. You know what happened after that? The locusts reproduced at such a rate that they ate more of the harvest that sparrows ever could even dream on eating.
Starvation. Then.
We have that.
And the
I think
Chinese
we had
were
that in the UK
buying
as well at
sparrows
one
from
point,
other
yeah.
countries.
Like
They had to
foxes
buy
and such.
sparrows from other countries around to kind of balance out their own ecosystem. My point is, Stalin could have done the industrialization with a lot less losses, with a lot less dead people.
Well, that's the question. At that rate, as the gentleman pointed forward, he wanted to put it 1,000 years in 10 years.
I think he could.
The whole point of murdering and the killing and etc. was to drive the idea that failure will not be accepted. And this is ultimately what supposedly led to people working under terrible conditions, working regardless of being treated X, Y, and Z. But this is why I think this is the difference between a good leader and a bad leader, right? A leader that takes its workers into consideration.
Takes time,
their thing. Exactly, it takes time.
I'll give you another example to your question is the Americans attacking Iraq. We're going to topple Saddam. We're going to bring democracy like we've got here. Hang on, it took you 300 years to get democracy. It didn't happen. You didn't invade the country and say there's democracy, get on with it.
Absolutely.
It took 300 years, and they expected to do it in 2 years, like 10,000 years in 10 years. Same thing happened in the Middle East. It's not going to work. It's going to take generation.
And I think that's where the brutal nature comes into it. When you can't force people to act normally and progress in that time, you then start to put a very kind of like sorry to use the word Pavlovian kind of like negative reinforcement, positive reinforcements kind of thing. When you do bad, you get negative reinforcements, and it teaches you if you fuck up kind of thing. So that's again back to the question. What do we think our world would look like today if we didn't have Stalin?
That's a good question, huh?
Hey, it is a good question.
Very hard.
I saw one of the
No man in the high castle reference, please.
no, nothing like that.
Leader of,
I saw a video,
Russia during
a
the
very
Second World
popular,
War.
kind of popular theory of what would happen if Stalin lost. Didn't lose, like he didn't succeed after Lenin. It would be Trotsky instead of him. And that theory explains that Trotsky would be much more aggressive and much more militaristic, and he would be a more capable military ruler than Stalin. He would be the one invading Nazi Germany and the other parts of Europe first, because Trotsky had a bigger idea of a world revolution. And it has a very funny thing that they said in that specific theory. It's that Hitler would lose before he would start implementing his extreme policies, before he would start exterminating the Jews. And thus, because he warned in Mein Kampf about the Soviets and about communism, he would be seen by a hero by the Europeans.
Yes.
Because he was the one who predicted this would happen, and he fell like a martyr of communism. And he would be actually the hero of Europe. The idea of Hitler would be the idea that Europeans would rally under to fight communism.
But would the industrialization?
It's a very interesting.
But would the industrialization have happened without Stalin?
I think it would. I don't know if it would happen at the same rate. But look, the thing about Stalin's murders is that they weren't all about the industrialization. They weren't all to just assert his power. For example, the extermination of the Ukrainians had nothing to do with industrialization. It had to do with the kolhosps. The kolhosps were basically the communal collectivism of farming. The Ukrainians didn't want the communes to confiscate all of their harvest and to just give them the bare minimum to survive. They didn't want to participate in that. And thus Stalin invaded Ukrainian cities and villages. He surrounded the villages. He confiscated all the food, and he led the Ukrainian staff to death. That's why we have the Holodomor.
You know where the grain went, didn't you? The grain went to Germany to pay for German machines that actually industrialized Russia.
Germany wasn't
but so he was happy to see Ukrainians starve. But to get the industrialization.
There were other ways. The primary point.
The Soviet Union is full of resources. The main resource they gave to the Germans was not grain, because there's only so much grain the Germans need. They don't have a huge population, and plus they also produce their own grain.
But they used it as a kind of economy.
I know. But look. The main resource given from the Soviets to the Germans, let's say during the Molotov treaty. You know the Molotov treaty, right? The treaty between Soviets and Germans to occupy parts of Poland and to the non-aggression pact. The Soviets would give oil and iron and prime materials to the Germans, so to give fuel to the German war machine, and the Germans would give technology to the Soviets, helping them to develop their industrialization.
Factory machinery.
Yeah, exactly. That was the main resource the Soviets were giving to the Germans. So the grain given from the Ukrainians to the Germans was not actually that much of a big necessity. It was a huge amount, but still, it wasn't the main thing that the Germans needed. The main thing was the oil, the iron, the coal. The main things.
Can I ask a quick question? Just because we're streaming off a topic in particular, I was trying to visualize what the world would look like if Stalin had not come about. We have gone to Trotsky, and I want to question just quickly because from what I know is that Trotsky was of Lenin's kind of like preaching, and one of the biggest examples of Stalin not being a communist is the fact that he seized the land that Lenin had already given back to the communes for himself and for the state in order to keep it in control and drive the Industrial Revolution. Now you keep saying that his main focus, or this idea that his primary goal was the Industrial Revolution, doesn't really, I guess, it's not sticking with the history that you learned. Can you tell me what in particular, other than the Industrial Revolution and this drive towards a bigger military power, what other things was he investing in? because from what I know, it was mainly that. I don't really know of
Heavy
any other
industry,
policies.
heavy industry, iron, steel, coal.
Yeah.
Heavy
The
industry,
main
mining.
difference between Stalin and Trotsky is not even their abilities, it's not their competence. The main difference is that their motive. Trotsky had the motive of expanding the communist revolution to the world. Stalin had the motive of having an iron grip over the Soviet Union. That's all. That's the main thing he wanted.
Could Trotsky have taken the world revolution to Germany and Austria and Hungary and Bulgaria
the Germans were
in the
afraid of
1930s? But yeah, I know.
The Workers' Socialist
they were
Party was
terrified
afraid
of
of
it. Yeah, it was one of the reasons why Hitler rose.
Yeah.
But could he have really done that in the 1930s? I don't
say
think
no.
so.
I
think
no, I
he,
mean Germany was pretty harsh against like communism at the
But
time
also
as well. Like they're
institutions of the
banning.
West as well.
Yeah, but
There was a lot of.
the Soviet Union was
Even back
ready
then.
for war way before Germany was ready for war.
But they never
that's
really
a fact.
pushed it. Though,
Yeah, they
in
never
comparison
really
to, like,
pushed
things.
because
So when
Stalin
we're
didn't want
talking
to
about
push.
Trotsky supposedly being more aggressive than Stalin, Stalin again, like you say, he's aggressive on his own people,
Yeah.
right? Not necessarily towards outwards.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example where Trotsky demonstrated, I guess, violence for anyone outside, other than focus on his own Russian communion? Because
That's the
from
problem
what I
of,
say, he's of Lenin's
what
teaching,
is-
and Lenin was mainly focused on communist Russia.
Yeah, but he also pursued
Trotsky-
the idea of a world revolution.
Yeah, Trotsky
Lenin
really
perceived
was
the
pushing that.
Yeah.
He really pushed that.
Lenin
Trotsky really
pursued-
pushed that.
Yeah,
think
exactly.
the reason-
Exactly
Yeah, go on.
because Trotsky followed more of Lenin's footsteps. That's exactly the reason why I'm telling that he would attack first. Because even though, Lenin was a bit more peaceful than Trotsky, he was not a military man. He was not a military leader. He was a speaker, he was an inspirer.
Yeah.
And now I'm not telling Lenin is a good guy, I don't like him too much either. But he was better than Stalin for sure, and I think he was still better than Trotsky, because Trotsky had an idea that he could wage war on all the world. He could expand, the revolution in a very quick, in a very decisive way.
This is the question I'm asking, because
Why am I saying this?
From my reading, from my reading in particular, I haven't seen anything that says Lenin and Trotsky were going to do it via military wise, because
Yeah, Lenin did say it.
communism spread to China without military means.
Yeah.
So the question is. I'm talking about in general the idea. I'm not talking
Military
about
invasion.
the.
Was it possible? Feasible?
Yeah, it was a
I
civil
agree
war.
with
It
you. I
wasn't
don't
another
think it was.
country invading China.
Say that again?
It was more about civil war of the
Yeah,
Chinese.
no, I know
it
how.
wasn't Russia invading
I know
China,
how
so
the
you're right
I
about
know how the
that.
communist state of China came about, and that's between themselves.
Yeah,
but what
yeah,
I'm trying to say is,
because of
it
civil
wasn't a Russian military regime that brought about communism into China. So
yeah.
my question is, where do we get this idea of the communist being this military aggressor pushing communism across the world? Because for me personally, I haven't seen it, but I at least concede that it may be ignorance. It may be I haven't read on it. I just want someone.
There was a fear of it before the Second World War, a
Massive
fear of
fear,
world communist takeover across
Massive.
the world. The thing is that the thing about after the war, the Soviet Union sort of managed to push the Nazis out of like Poland and Bulgaria and Romania and a whole load of sort of and then they sat there. The idea was they're supposed to hand those countries back to the Poles
Yeah.
and to the Romania, and they didn't.
Yeah.
They stayed there.
Absolutely.
And that's where the idea about the aggressive.
Okay,
that's
I
where
see.
the
No,
idea.
but look, you're talking. You're right. You're right
Satellite
about what you're
states,
saying.
the
You're right about
Soviet
what
bloc.
you're saying. You're totally
Occupation,
right.
I see what
But
you're
that
saying,
happened
yeah.
way before the distinction between Stalin and Trotsky. If Trotsky succeeded after Lenin, it would happen way before the occupation of the Eastern
if
European
they weren't
countries.
industrialised, how would they do
Yeah,
that?
absolutely.
Wait. I think they would still industrialize. They might not industrialize at the exact same rate, but they would still industrialize. Why am I saying that Trotsky would attack the Germans and would attack Europe before the Germans would attack him? Because Trotsky, you can take me up on it. You can look it up.
Absolutely.
Trotsky was a military leader.
Yeah.
Lenin was the guy that made the speeches, that made was looking good for the people, that was expanding the ideology, and Trotsky was the guy that was organizing the army, the military forces, right?
And he won the
Trotsky was
Civil
the
War.
main
And he
military
won the
guy.
Civil
Yeah,
War.
Trotsky was the guy who won the Civil War. He invaded Ukraine because Ukraine separated. He invaded other countries like the Belt.
Fought off about 7 armies at the same time.
Yeah, and he won the Civil War, Trotsky. He was a good leader, a good military leader. And that is why I would assume that Trotsky would have a more active approach to Nazi Germany, because Stalin was kind of deluded by thinking Hitler would not attack him, because basically that's what Stalin was thinking, because Stalin didn't prepare at all the border against the Nazi invasion. Now Trotsky would get prepared, and I'm pretty sure that Trotsky would attack first, because the best defense is offense. Once you see the enemy as weak, you attack and you quickly overwhelm. That's how Hitler defeated the French. I mean, that's how Hitler defeated the French. He would never have any success in
I think
the
we're being
Second
a bit presumptive, though. That's one of my biggest problems
Okay, fair
with like
enough, but it's
historical.
a what-if situation.
No, I understand. But I think, sorry, go on. If you wanna...
No. But I mean, look. The thing is that one of the reasons why the Russians were so powerful and were finally able, the Russian steamroller was able to push the Nazis out of the Eastern Europe, was because of American trucks, American materials, American rations, Yes, it was.
In the Soviet Union.
In the Soviet Union. It's something that's
I don't
not
agree
really...
with that.
I can actually cite chapter and verse on that. I really can.
The Americans didn't cooperate very well with the
Oh,
Soviets.
no,
That's
sorry.
not true.
Well,
That's
no,
not
no,
true.
no,
After-
They didn't
Yeah, I'm
cooperate.
sorry. No.
After the
One of the
Listen,
reasons...
guys, there's even a story about the capture of Berlin, that the Soviets opened artillery fire, a little bit over the positions that the Allies were about to capture. And the Allies were like, whoa, what are you doing? We're about to attack this. And they were like, oh, sorry, it was an accident. So they would occupy Berlin
American
first.
trucks, American materials, American ammunition materials, weapons materials, loads and loads of materials went to Soviet Union and
Where
enabled
did
it
you
to
get that
fight.
information from?
I can't remember the name. I actually read a book on this, and the thing is, on the Eastern Front, and one of the reasons why the Russians were able to push the Nazis out of Eastern Europe.
Was there not an attitude in the
Because-
United States
because-
government that they would hope the Nazis would defeat the Soviets in the hope that communism would be shut down?
Well, I think that the idea was just to beat the Nazis. The thing is that the Nazis at one point was sort of unbeatable on the field of battle. They beat everyone,
true.
right? And so the Americans, did everything. Your enemy's enemy is my friend, and so they did everything they could to support the Americans,
They supported
the
the
Russians,
weaker enemy,
and the
so the
British.
stronger enemy would be defeated. I understand the
I was
logic.
just going to say, just to back up what you're saying in particular, because I think the idea that Russia and America have always been at odds is more kind of like post-Cold War than it is pre-Cold War, because after Germany was defeated and they were deciding what they wanted to do with like the German military soldiers and Nazis, I think it was Roosevelt at the time who was there, and Stalin. They were both making laughs and they were both making jokes about how to exterminate the Nazis. The only person who stood in and said kind of like, guys, you can't really kill anyone was Churchill.
Yeah.
Was Churchill. So this goes to show, in particular, the same wavelength that America and Russia were on at the time. Again, very small, kind of anecdotal, kind of
There's
like
loads
thing.
of
But
it,
for the leaders to be on
tons and tons
for
and
the leaders
tons
to
of
be on
materials.
joking terms like that, for me, it says a little bit more about the interaction between America and Russia than nowadays, where the presidents won't even sit down with Putin to have a word. Obama,
Maybe I'm missing something here, but I'll be honest
Historically-
with you guys. I
history's
never
broad.
ever heard about any considerable, sizable
Oh yes, it helped
military
Russia
help
win the war.
from America
It helped
to Russia or to the Soviet Union.
Not tanks.
All I've heard about was a little bit of supplies, of provision of supplies, a little bit, not too much. And the main reason for me to say that, even guys, because I don't think it makes a lot of sense. Stalin would never, ever, he would rather let his people starve to death.
No military is sovereign, you know that, right?
No military.
No
sovereign.
military is sovereign, i.e. jets are made in different parts of the country. They're bought
Well,
from
yeah, the
different
Soviets
pieces of
got
the country.
most of their technology from the Nazis.
No
yeah,
military is
not most of
sovereign.
it, but part of it. They got developed.
The
technology
idea,
from the Nazis.
the idea that again, Russian jets are Russian jets, American jets are American jets, and that's it. No, that's not how it works. That's not how the game militarism works. Even with the the F-35s now, they're made in Turkey, is it? The F-35s, they're made in Turkey.
Guys,
Russia
for some reason, the U.S. doesn't produce Kalashnikovs. For some reason, the U.S. doesn't produce Kalashnikovs, and for some reason, the Russians don't produce exactly the same guns that the Americans do, at least on a large scale.
That was the thing. They didn't supply them. They didn't actually supply them with frontline weapons and
So, what did they supply them with?
food, ammunition, trucks, the logistics to enable the Russian art to field like 7, 8.
Okay, I do agree about
armies.
the provisions, about food. I do
No,
agree
no,
about
it was
those.
enough to actually keep Russia afloat, to fight a war, and to actually, and also all the technology they needed. One of the things is that when they started the war, they didn't have any technology for radio technology. The Americans gave them everything. All the radio technology.
This goes with the illiteracy rate and the poverty and everything that was pretty much
The
at the
literacy
time.
rate doesn't really matter too much here because the elites of the Soviet Union usually knew at least roughly what they were doing. Obviously, the generals were not good because, again, Stalin killed the
Yeah,
good
but
generals.
the thing is, if
But
you've got
there were good scientists.
if you've got illiterates, they don't really make great soldiers.
Obviously not, but you just
You know what I
to
mean?
teach a guy how to shoot. Again, you don't need to teach him the alphabet or to teach him words or whatever. You just need to teach him a few simple things about the gun, and that's it.
Not
He goes to
necessarily.
shoot.
You know to take a sniper course is very difficult. You
Oh yeah,
have to know
definitely. The snipers are very specialized
so
troops.
If we're talking about guns, we're talking about a wide vocabulary of guns here. You know,
They
that
didn't
was
have
used
it.
during the
They didn't
war.
have it in the Soviet Union. The troops were very simply equipped. Sometimes, in the siege
Not
of
enough
Kiev,
weapons.
Exactly. In the siege of Kiev, when they were retaking the city from the Nazis, they would come into towns and take people as what they call Strafbataillon, which is basically the battalion of the penal battalion. You know what I mean? They would just take normal people and put them in a penal battalion, arm them with bricks. I'm not joking, with bricks cut in half, and they would send them just forward, just to see which way, where
As a
were
meat
the
shield.
yeah,
As a meat shield.
to see where were the main gun lines, where were the main guns, the main machine
So
guns of the
pawns and
Nazis.
chess, for want of a better word.
That, they basically used cannon fodder to a great extent. And again, guys, you're saying that they provided bullets, that the Americans provided bullets, they provided some kind of ammunition. How did they provide it if the bullets the Soviets needed were different from the bullets the Americans used? The guns were different, the equipment was different, the tanks and every single part of equipment was completely different.
I can provide
Yeah, I was gonna
chapter
say,
and verse
yeah,
on this.
no,
There's loads and loads of material on this. That it's one of those things that's not talked about. That at the end of the war, the Soviets didn't want it to be known that the Americans had supplied so much materials, right? But basically, Russia couldn't have fought the war that they fought without the massive support. Nearly every lorry that you would see, every truck that you saw in Soviet Russia after 1942 would have been an American truck, mainly, primarily, right? And large number, and most of the cotton and material for the uniforms that would have been supplied from America.
I won't argue completely against
There's loads
it
and loads
because
of
it's
material.
possible that I might not know the extent of that help. I do know there was some help.
And you know that
I'll let you guys go on. I'll let you guys
Okay,
go on.
okay.
I'll see you in a second.
You know that Stalin had a complete nervous breakdown. He had a complete nervous breakdown after Barbarossa. And they just
Yeah, I know. They actually had to fetch him to his dacha.
And he thought he was gonna
isolated
get shot,
himself,
yeah.
and it was a very cringe-worthy story, honestly.
He got his faith back in God as well, I heard. He
Yeah,
started to pray.
like he was basically waiting for there to be a coup d'état. He was waiting to be deposed, and there were soldiers who came to his place, generals, and he asked what do you want? Why are you getting me? Oh, and they said, could you please come back to your duty? He was expecting to actually get shot, and he said. Isn't there anybody worthier than me? Who's worthiest? And they told him there's nobody worthier than you, and blah blah blah, just licked his ass, blah blah blah. He just went back to power, which was honestly a stupid decision to do, because even though it would make a difficult transition of power, Stalin was definitely not a person
So
to
can you
command
see
the
that in
army.
those circumstances he would have no qualms from taking. He was fighting for his very survival, right, to stay alive. And in those circumstances, if the Americans are offering free stuff that's going to help you win the war, you're going to take it.
Again, as I said, look,
You know they're going to take it. If you're
Okay.
fighting for your survival, you will do whatever's necessary.
Okay. I understand your point of view, but then again, I understand my point of view. I never actually heard about some kind of a huge help from the Americans to
Massive.
the Soviets. I never heard of such a massive help. Also I sometimes hear misconceptions.
Next week I will show you.
Okay, show me the proof you've got. I'll also research about it myself, but I don't really think there's that much help, that much of massive help gone to the Soviets from the
The
Americans.
Russians gave us time, right? They enabled the Americans and British time to actually get together so that they could actually do their invasion on the second front. The thing is most of the fighting and dying was done by Russian soldiers in the Second World War. I think it's a ratio of something like 18-1. It's like
45 million I heard died on the Eastern Front. That's not Russians. That's all Jewish people in the East.
and only 45 million, and it's 250,000 in this country. So it's a quarter of a million.
That's including armed forces as well. Remember,
No, obviously, yeah. Definitely.
not just civilians.
Anyway,
Yeah. Good job.
Content over everything. From your
Come, man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
Which goes back to the discussion we've had earlier, where I see the principle that the fact that you have a bed or you have a home and there's a wall between your bedroom and the rest of the house. See, it goes right the way back, and the rest of your flat. Yeah, that's right. So these are just management areas, but that doesn't mean that you can't invite your friends round